Integration Group. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar series and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization. We provide our members with objective information and resources for renewable energy and energy systems integration decisions, peer-to-peer networking opportunities, information and knowledge sharing, and professional education experience. Our most recent activity was our Fall Technical Workshop in Denver last month, and our next activity will be the Spring Technical Workshop. It'll be outside Albuquerque in March. It's going to be immediately followed by an International Energy Systems Integration Workshop in London. These workshops deal with a full range of issues associated with integrating wind and solar into electric, gas, and thermal systems, and coupling to energy-consuming infrastructures such as electric transportation, buildings, and industry. Registration will open soon, and everyone is invited to attend. ESIG is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else. So if you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find us at www.esig.energy. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, the phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For those of you who are on the last webinar, you may recall we had a very distracting interference on the line, and we never did find out what caused that, but we hope that it doesn't happen again. Okay, so we'd ask you to use the question and answer box on the lower right-hand side of your screen to submit questions, and we'll save 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. Okay, so today our webinar is on the topic of cataloging national hydropower flexibility. It'll be dealing with activities sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office. The webinar will feature Patrick O'Connor, an energy analyst at the Oak Ridge National Lab, and Nathalie Voisin, a staff water resources engineer at the Pacific Northwest National Lab, who also holds a dual appointment as an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Washington. Patrick manages projects assessing the markets, policy, and economics of hydropower, energy storage, and the electric power sector more broadly, while Nathalie leads interdisciplinary research projects focusing on coupling climate, hydrology, and water resource management models with power system models, including production cost and building energy demand. I feel very fortunate to have them here with us today. And on a personal note, I've been taking a look on LinkedIn recently before our webinars just to see how many common friends I have with the presenters, just a matter of personal interest. I took a look last night, and I found out that Patrick and I have only 20 connections, and Nathalie and I have even fewer, only 3. So it's clear to me that we need to work together a little more closely and get to know each other a little better, and I look forward to doing that beginning with this webinar. Hydroelectric plants contribute significant flexibility to the system. Our webinar today will cover how the hydropower fleet is operated under today's increasing demands for flexibility and its potential to provide further flexibility for the integration of wind and solar resources. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Patrick, I'll now turn it over to you. I think you have the ball.
All right. Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here and walk you all through this. As a little bit of context and overview, we're here because, as was mentioned, the DOE Water Power Technologies Office, is asked Nathalie and I to come in and talk about hydropower flexibility because it's a major topic of concern for them. And when you think about the goals and membership of ESIG, it's a place where we think we can disseminate information and learn as well. So I'm going to walk you through what we know at the national scale, what we consistently look at through time about hydropower flexibility and value. I'll be sort of excerpting extensively from our 2017 Hydropower Market Report we published this year. And then I'm going to introduce you to a project that we're sort of rounding completion on, but how we fill in gaps, what we're hoping to learn. It's called the DOE Hydropower Value Study, and we're able to dive down in more detail than what you'll see in the national scale. And ultimately, I want to turn it over to Nathalie to go on from what I've talked about in terms of knowledge and gaps and give us a deep dive into a really important topic via a case study. So to kick things off, I think most of you are familiar conceptually with why hydropower, but we have about 100 gigawatts here in the United States. Approximately 20% of that is pumped storage, the primary source of energy storage at the bulk level in the U.S. and the world. But you do have changes in energy markets. Incentives are changing, operations are changing, and when we try to craft an R&D portfolio and make positive change in light of an uncertain future, we have to understand how and why hydropower is a source of existing flexibility. How it's compensated, what its capabilities are. Can we look across the whole fleet and set an impactful R&D agenda? And so that's where a lot of this interest comes from the Department of Energy. There is, however, one really, really significant challenge in hydropower, which is that every plant is unique. It's a snowflake, and I've taken the liberty here to embrace the season and put some snowflakes up and intersperse with them. On the right-hand side, you'll see 3 different types of hydropower turbines. If you're not familiar with hydropower technology, each one of these turbine designs does the same thing. It converts water and pressure into electricity, but it does so in sometimes fundamentally different ways. Each machine has different characteristics, and it's these technology and design characteristics that create part of the flexibility, and it's all site-specific. Everything from the turbines themselves to the generators, controls, water conveyance, plant configuration, that's going to influence from the smallest time steps out to hours and days and months of how and capable a single plant is of integrating renewable energy or responding to the incentives and market prices. I think we tend to focus a lot on the technology aspect, but a really significant portion of flexibility considerations comes in the form of water availability. That's weather and climate, and then what you do with it in terms of water management. Hydropower projects, often there's a common refrain that says hydropower is a byproduct of managing a river system for other uses, whether it's irrigation or flood control. And so the flexibility of the power generating aspects of a river system has to be considered within the context of what you do, how you operate it, how you plan. And so not only is every hydropower plant different, we have a lot of them. There are a lot of snowflakes in that context. This is our national hydropower map. It shows more or less every hydro plant in the U.S. Different colors indicate different ownership, different types of investment strategies, different types of operating strategies. The size of the bubble indicates the size of the plant. Different shape means different configurations, whether it's hydropower or pump storage or some combination therein. And you could take this in 100 other dimensions and talk about how you differentiate hydropower plants. But the same challenge remains the same, which is that we have a lot of potentially flexible resources. It's just hard to know much about them in a consistent way. And so to talk about that, I want to introduce this concept of timescales as drivers of hydropower flexibility. I've taken a chart here from the Department of Energy's Quadrennial Energy Review from last year. I think there's lots of different charts like this that map out what's happening in the power system at different timescales. But this is a useful starting point, and I've overlaid here at the bottom different types of drivers in a hydropower context. And so when you're talking about the things that happen without human control, whether it's response to faults or automated controls, that's completely dependent on how you design machines. When you move out to longer timescales, even within a day, within an hour, that depends on how you configure your plant, and then the real long-term flexibility, how you move energy in large blocks to meet demand and prices and needs comes through water management. Overlaid on that, spanning your daily timescales all the way out to years and decades, is changes in weather and changes in climate. And so it's in this, extremely complex space and extremely broad space that we have to quantify what we can and understand what we can to help support DOE and them executing an impactful R&D strategy. So I want to introduce what we do know at national scale, the things we're able to track consistently across the whole country. and that comes out of the 2017 Hydropower Market Report. There's a link here if you want to come back and revisit some of what we've published or see the whole document. But we focus on large data sources to track industry evolution for hydropower. That's the Energy Information Administration and FERC collect blocks of data, and then independent system operators and NERC also have public reports that help us tease out things about hydropower and its ability to provide flexibility to the power system. So, let's see here. First thing I want to highlight is that at a macro scale, it's really water that drives capabilities. All of these, what you're seeing on the top row here for the different regions of the U.S. is hydropower utilization. We've taken the scale off just so it's relative to that region. The second row is pumped storage utilization relative to that region, and the bottom row is electricity consumption in that region as well. And so at this really bulk scale using monthly aggregated data, we're able to see a couple clear things. One is that when you have power, when you have water as fuel available to generate power with hydropower dams, doesn't always line up with at least the highest times electricity consumption. That's clearest, I think, in the southeast and northeast and northwest as well, where you have seasonal impacts on when you get your water. On the other hand, if you have a different type of plant configuration, if you have pumped storage, our orange row there, you're able to track the overall needs of the power system much better. And so even on a monthly basis, we're able to see how dispatchable energy in the form of pumped storage, or if you're thinking about the Southwest with very large scale, hydropower storage in Grand Coulee and Glen Canyon and those types of water resource infrastructure, better able to match actual electricity needs thus far. And even in the context of those monthly and energy type constraints from water availability, the hydropower fleet in aggregate is quite flexible. On the left-hand side of this slide, I have a chart here from our market report that shows how hydropower, the light blue line towards the bottom, tracks net load within the California ISO. And so you have some pump storage plants here, you have lots of small hydro, you have some bigger hydro as well, but in aggregate, the fleet is able to track these net load deviations where you have significant amounts of solar. Everyone's, I think, pretty familiar with the duck curve. But what's interesting is you sort of see these seasonal variations as well, where if you look in spring, there's a floor of about 2 gigawatt hours on an hourly basis of hydropower minimum that comes in, and that drops during the summer and fall, and you lose some flexibility as well, simply because you have less water and you have competing needs for that water. But still in aggregate, you can see over on the right-hand side, we have the hourly observed ramping behavior of hydropower compared to in aggregate natural gas for all of the ISOs in the U.S. And you have your medians and your 90th and 10th percentiles here in the chart. But hydropower ramps up more significantly and down more significantly than the gas fleet in aggregate in each of these ISOs. That's partly because you have dispatchability of pump storage, and partly because you still have storage and flexibility capability even within smaller plants and those with other water use constraints. We're able to observe at national scale differences in operational patterns. The larger your unit is, probably the more valuable it is to the power system, and the more it's used in a situational context. So what you're looking at is for different sizes of units, less than 10 megawatts, 10 to 100, those over 100 megawatts, and then pumped storage units, how often they're started on average in a given year. So our small hydro obviously doesn't start all that much. I think the typical small hydro plant in the median here is started once every month. They run fairly continuously. As your units get larger, you're talking still that once a month, but there's some that are once a week. By the time you're at your largest units, typically they're starting once a week, which means they're stopping and responding to differing demands on the power system. And then everyone's most flexible resource, pumped storage, starting multiple times per day. And so it's these differential capabilities that are driving flexibility and value in a lot of these markets. And in terms of value itself, we're able to track differences by region, and not surprisingly, for those of you who are familiar with relative electricity prices, a megawatt hour of hydropower is pretty, on average, more valuable than the average megawatt hour in a market. But even though we talk at length about ancillary services and other values, it's really energy. And when I say energy, I mean the price of natural gas that drives the relative price of hydro. And so you see these annual trends in each of the regions, but it correlates very strongly to the price of natural gas simply because that's what's setting marginal prices, whether it's energy or ancillary services. But even within all this, we can take little glimpses of the future. As part of our market report, we work with PG&E to take a look in more depth at the Helms Plant. And so obviously in response to increasing penetrations of solar, you can see in this top chart here that their pump storage plant has increasingly been pumping throughout the day in a sort of pronounced operational shift from traditional pump storage day-night arbitrage operations. That certainly is a glimpse of, I would even say, the present for PG&E, but as the power system evolves in the rest of the country, we may see similar demands on other projects as well. Within all of this, we have increasing flexibility. We have our needs for flexibility. We're also seeing rising costs. I don't want to say that's the cause. That would be the holy grail of identification if we could, but all we do know is that the cost to operate and maintain hydropower of all stripes it's increasing at rates in excess of inflation, and the availability of these projects is declining as well. So on the upper left-hand side, you can see information that comes out of NERC GADS. This is about the hydropower fleet in aggregate since 2005, where for all sizes of units, we're seeing decreases in availability and increases in forest and plant outage rates. On the right-hand side, there's a chart tracking O&M costs in absolute terms on the left-hand part of that panel, and then in relative to 2007 on the right-hand side. And for most size classes of hydropower, we're seeing increases. It's only the biggest units, inclusive of pump storage, that have been able to keep costs down. And so as we think about hydropower as an existing source of flexibility, the fact that its costs are increasing and availability is decreasing is probably not a good thing at all, and begs for solutions. So, I think what you've noticed is that we talk a lot about flexibility, but what you've seen out of the market report is at a highly aggregated scale. And so when we do national analyses like this, we have limited visibility into the rest of what's happening in the power system, some of the key technical capabilities of hydropower, and what we're really only seeing is the influence in the aggregate of certain water management practices and the weather and climate aspects. Even then, that's kind of generous. We can do what we can at national scale. We can do what we can when aggregating through time and across spatial scales, but to make better informed decisions, we really need better data. And so that was the motivation here for DOE's new Hydropower Value Study project, is can we do better to inform the R&D agenda, not just to track industry trends, but can we actually learn things about operations, learn things about plant configurations that allows DOE to make informed investments. And so this is a multi-lab effort led by PNNL, a colleague of Nathalie and myself, Abhishek Samani, is leading that project. And it's, just broadly, can we learn from case studies, and can we do more detailed, more focused data collection to answer these questions? The project itself is split up into 3 different core tasks. The first is a landscape analysis. This is, in general, a more granular look about how hydropower is being operated across the country, why it operates the way it does, how it's valued, and there's a really interesting component of this. I'm not going to talk about it here, but if you want to know more, follow up on how do you look at the value and can you monetize the value of certain streams that we hear from hydropower owners at least they're providing, but they're not being compensated for. And so inertia is the primary focus there. Building from where hydropower is and is operated today, we're looking at future value drivers as well. That's how the power system evolves, what possible paths are there, and what sort of demands and what sort of value is going to be placed on flexibility for hydropower in the future. To tie those two things together, we have a task on capabilities and constraints. And that's looking at what I've talked a little bit about here so far, which is the technical and water management drivers of flexibility. Can we drill down within a project, within a unit, and identify specific types of configurations that increase or decrease flexibility? And at that point, you can start making decisions about, can you, at a cost, become more flexible, and can we quantify that? I'll give you a few examples from this capabilities and constraints piece here, but I think hydropower is its own challenge. So we're working from plant and unit scale databases. These are organizations and types of information that we are involved with utilities for and other contexts. So there's electric utility cost group, data stored in HydroAmp, and other centralized sources. Where it doesn't exist, we can try and make inferences, but we're still swimming uphill and trying to identify each and every one of these snowflakes to the extent we can. So just some observations from what we found here. To the extent we can quantify flexibility in the fleet on the left-hand side, I'm presenting some data that actually comes out of the Energy Information Administration, new requirements in their standard data forms, showing that the vast majority of hydropower, over 80%, can cold start in less than 10 minutes. And when you think about that, that means it's ramping even faster. These are for, I'll call them conventional resources, very, very fast and flexible, and the vast majority of that remaining 20% starts within an hour due to various technical and plant constraints. But different types of units are used very differently. There's different value drivers and different capabilities. In this right-hand chart, I'm presenting some data from one of our utility partners, so it's obviously blinded here, but what you're seeing in terms of the height of these bars is the amount a unit moves on average within a day. So I'll use this pump storage bar over here as an example. This is a 100 megawatt unit. The scale you're looking at here is the number of megawatts it moves up and down in a day in absolute. And so this pump storage plant is extremely flexible, and if it was starting and pumping once a day and stopped, that would be 2 times its capacity. But instead you're seeing nearly 50. These are units that are coming on and off, they're following load and incurring the associated wear and tear. And some more conventional units, like the one I have here, the unit often on AGC, it's about 13 to 15 times its installed capacity and mileage on an average day. Not quite as much as the pump storage, but that's still quite a bit of movement from a set point. And then there's certain other types of projects. Here we have 2 small hydro plants that, if you looked at the numbers on their own in terms of capacity and design characteristics are very similar. But you can see in the illustrated impact of water management constraints here, where our generic small hydro unit moves about 5 times its capacity in a given day, but our small hydro unit with recreation constraints doesn't move much at all. It runs flat out. It's there for other purposes, and energy, in a lot of cases, is a side benefit. Some other things we found is trying to dig down more deeply into how individual unit and plant and site characteristics influence flexibility and capabilities for flexibility. And so on the right-hand side here, this is a pretty, I think, succinct illustration that different types of hydropower, different configurations, different site characteristics, in this case, have fundamentally different inertia characteristics. And so what you're seeing is these blue X's are propeller type units. If you're familiar with hydropower, these are Kaplans or fixed blades. And your green units are Francis types. The propeller types are lower head. So for you have less pressure differential. That means for a given capacity here on the x-axis, you're going to have a bigger, heavier unit, and that unit's just going to have more inertia by the nature of its design. And so the characteristics of the fleet here as an illustration are going to have a profound amount of influence on how hydropower in aggregate is able to respond to a changing grid. In addition to direct inertia, there's stability characteristics that also vary. And I think often when we're looking at new hydropower, we often think pump storage, and then there's decisions to be made there whether you have a fixed pump or a variable speed pump. And those come with certain technical capability trade-offs. Your fixed speed pump is going to be synchronous. It's going to have inertia, and if that's valuable in the system, you would almost prefer that. But the variable speed is considerably more flexible. You can follow load. You can follow renewables when pumping. You have very fast frequency response. You're just not providing that spinning mass to the power system. And so even at the choice of generator configuration, you have these fundamental capability trade-offs. But even beyond how you put a machine together, you have capabilities that vary across all time scales simply from how you manage water and what the other demands are on a project. So in general, that leaves us at a place where we have lots of information, we have lots of stories to tell, but we need to tie it together in a way that provides, really good insight. I'd be curious to hear from you all if you have questions on what sort of things you'd like to know about the hydropower fleet and how we can communicate those. In general, we need better information at the unit level. We were able to collect a lot of that, but at the plant level and certainly in water management, it's hard to look consistently across the fleet. There's even sort of an existential question of can you catalog in a coherent way water management practices for 2,000 hydropower plants? In the absence of the capability to do that, though, case studies are really useful. We can take these complex interrelationships between equipment design, plant design, hydrology, and institutions and put them in context. So I'm going to turn over the presentation now to Nathalie to discuss how hydrological constraints influence flexibility, and she'll talk through that in concept and then give us some results from one of our case studies.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So we'll go ahead and continue with Nathalie. I'll hold the questions until the end, make sure that Nathalie has time to get her presentation done before we move into the Q&A. So Nathalie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So as Patrick said, I'm going to cover the part where we look at opportunities and constraints of hydrology on the flexibility of hydropower. It's pretty vague, so let me make sure that I'm giving here a more focused question. Actual question that we try to address is what is the contribution of operational experience to overall hydropower evaluation? The way to value hydropower, there are, like we said, we have multiple tasks to do this, and leveraging the EPRI report, there is the economic value, the market structure, the technology and cost, and here really following on this operational experience, like Patrick said, there are a couple of different snowflakes, and we want to understand how those snowflakes evolve. And from I'm going to give a hydrologist perspective, it means that I'm looking at very different scale. So to give that hydrology perspective, I'm going to start back from a very large scale. And by providing a focus and by defining those operational constraints, there are multiple technology over the entire that we use in our generation portfolio. And the grid, or here the power system, the market and electrical, provide a certain sense of flexibility. The facilities itself and constraints provide constraints and flexibility, and then there is the part that is fuel specific. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about really that green part. What are the fuel specific constraints? And even though here it says environmental and regulatory, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to call it water availability because it comes from water management, which is pretty complex by itself. And we're not going to identify which multiple objective for water management is targeted. It's just water availability coming from water management. And make the assumptions that the constraints and opportunities that we're going to identify are fuel specific, while there will be other opportunities that are provided by the power system, And that should be common to all fuel, no matter where it's coming from. And we're going to test this hypothesis. Just as a spoiler, it is there is fuel-specific opportunities, but they are being tuned up by flexibility requests from the power system. So, just a bit of hydrology facts about hydropower, because I'm a hydrologist and I realize that I'm talking with a lot of power system, which might explain why I only have 3 connections here with Charlie. So over the U.S., here I'm presenting as the colors the river basins. Those are physical constraints. These are not energy or man-made delineation of water management. They are physical. All the precipitation that falls within that domain is going to be routed into streams and then flows through main rivers toward the ocean. What it means with respect to that fuel's characteristics is that water is free, it comes at no cost, and the transport by itself is also free. It's provided by the river system. And there is a huge storage that is also very economic because it's provided by snowpack and also by the storage within the river itself. The capabilities that it's provided is that, sure, it's variable. There is more or less precipitation depending on the seasons. Sometimes that's snowpacks, and precipitation are not the same every year. So you have an interannual variability. Some people see that variability as a constraint, and I'm going to demonstrate how it's actually an opportunity. It's also that fuel is also providing a lot of predictability, because we understand and we know how much is in the river. Again, here I'm going to refer to Patrick's talk. Along certain time scale, we do know and we can observe the snowpack, and we can infer how much water there will be in the reservoir and how much we can generate. So there is a safety in terms of the availability of the fuel, because we know a couple of months in advance how it looks like. All of the what is different from other technologies and other fuel is that all the plants along the river are interconnected by that river systems. It means that operations need to be coordinated. It can be a constraint, it can also be an opportunity if this is well harnessed. And finally, energy is one water user, but there are also other water users for water supply, flood control, recreation, irrigation, and so on. And all of those stakeholders have been together and put a complex river basin management plan, which is subject to complex multi-objective and multi-scale optimization so that we can meet all of those objectives. What that provides as well is insight on what will the operation be and when the fuel is going to be available. So I just wanted to provide this so that we can make the contrast with other technology, and in particular thermoelectric capacity. So how is hydropower used over the entire U.S.? Here you have the 8 NERC regions, and you can see the capacity portfolio. And based on the opportunity provided by hydrology, you can see how the regions are harnessing, already using the opportunity of hydropower with much more over the WEC. It's about 20% of the capacity, and a bit less on the eastern U.S. What we're going to look at is how each region is harnessing the hydrology and hydropower. The capacity factor is the ratio of the generation over the capacity. With hydropower and having a no-cost fuel, we actually expect to have capacity factor being pretty high. So what we're looking here is the capacity factor over those 8 regions, going from the western U.S., the WEC, and moving east to the right. And in yellow, this is the regional average capacity factor, meaning for all technology combined. And the fact that it's all technology combined, meaning that if we look at our pie here and the type of constraints and opportunities, this is a non-fuel specific constraints on the capacity factor coming from power system and facility by itself. What you can see from the thermoelectric in grid, the thermoelectric fuel is always available, and the capacity factor is much higher for this type of capacity throughout all of the regions. There is some regional variations that is being highlighted here, which has to do with the differences in regional portfolio. But the fact is that that capacity factor is much higher. So it leads us to the conclusion that there must be something in hydropower, and just as a reference, I'm also showing wind and solar combined that also have a lower capacity factor. Why is the capacity factor lower? And there is a lot to do with hydrology availability, and I'm going to set up the thermoelectric capacity factor here as a benchmark. If there was no constraints coming from hydrology, it can assume that the capacity factor for hydropower should be at least as high as a thermoelectric capability. That's in the assumptions for this presentation. Then that helps us quantify those hydrology constraints and opportunities. A little close-up here on the western U.S., which is where we've got the higher penetration of hydropower in the market. And what I want to highlight here is showing on how over the Northwest you have over 50% of the capacity that is provided by hydropower. And despite this, the capacity factor is still about 0.3. Here again, I just want to do, those measures are very tricky. So I want to specify that this is a capacity factor that has to do with the nameplate capacity. The capacity is not changing throughout the year for this metric, so that we can really compare with other capabilities. But the point is, again, that even if the capacity is higher, the capacity factor across technology, across the regions remains the same. So why is the contribution of hydrology to lowering this capacity factor? It was maybe a bit naive approach. So I just want to specify here what is the decomposition of the hydropower capacity factor. It's only one measure out of others, with the understanding that only the generation is contributing to that factor. So we're talking about the firm generation and the load following. And there are other services that are requirements from the power system. Here again, looking at our little pie, the requirements from the power system that lower this measure. And that includes the spinning and non-spinning reserve. There is also potentially joint water management, including seasonally varying capacity. And then other requirements from power system that might come from the coordination with other technologies. So all of these affects and results in hydropower capacity factor of about 0.3. What I'd like to understand and what I'd like to demonstrate here is what is the role and contribution of interannual and seasonal variation in fuel availability. Again, by fuel availability, I'm also including everything that is included in water management. If coming back to the Northwest, over the Pacific Northwest, combined seasonal and interannual variability in hydrologic conditions lead to large variations in hydropower capacity factor. We know it. Question is how much? So if you're looking on this graph here on the upper left corner, we're looking at the interannual variability in capacity factor over the entire Northwest between 1981 to 2012. It's showing here you've got the mean and the max, and the median plus or minus the standard deviation. The range provided by interannual variability provides capacity factor ranging from 0.25 to 0.4, so with a variation of -7% to +10%, which can be considered as an opportunity to generate more during the wet years. When you looked at the seasonal variability in the fuel, so this is that upper right corner here, there is a large seasonal variation here again, leading to variation in capacity factor of about from +8 to -8%. So it can be considered as an opportunity to increase this capacity factor in the spring, and there might be, well, it's a lower capacity factor in the summer. I'm going to show how this can be as well harnessed as an opportunity when it's when it's coordinated with with power system operations. The last point to show is that in terms of predictability, you really need to combine both the interannual variability and seasonality to understand how the capacity factor is impacted. When you compound the two events, seasonality and interannual variability, the variation in capacity factor goes to +20% to -15%. That is that variation that sometimes is seen as a challenge for coordinating for power systems. And strangely, however, when you look at long-term planning, sometimes this variability is, however, not well represented. So I'm just making this remark because it's going to impact how we value and how we understand hydrology constraints on hydropower. So this was at the Northwest scale. The value of hydropower and how hydrology is impacting hydropower operations is varying across scale. So I want to do here a dive up on a case study, which is the Chelan PUD. Chelan is located over the Northwest and consists of a storage project on a tributary of the Columbia River, and has got two runs of the river that are downstream of Grand Coulee, and a set of very large storage projects in the US and Canada. So the inflow into those projects is extremely regulated. It's a hydropower only, and like many hydropower utilities, services are marketed for the entire project. That's important to know because water management can be pretty complex and is usually reserved for the river operators, and then they market the services as a whole to the grid. It means that water manager also ensuring the coordination between the plants for water management purpose and for the grid purpose as well. On the right, you have the outflow from Rocky Ridge for 3 years, a dry year, an average year, and a wet year. And as you can see, the blue one, the turquoise, is the flow that going to the turbine, and in salmon orange is what goes through the spill. The spill is necessary for downstream benefits such as flood control, water quality, and simply as well for dam safety. It's limited by storage. Across the entire US, only a couple of reservoirs can store the annual flow and then have a perfect, very flat flow throughout the year. Most reservoirs can only store about a couple months worth of flow. So the predictability of the fuel is about three months, and it varies from one dam to another. And so here, that's why we have, there is some spill that is being handled by water management. And you can see that interannual variability is affecting that spill more than what goes through the turbine. When you look at how operations are impacted, here we're looking at the capacity factor again for the entire Chelan project, and for two periods, one for the high flow and the other one for the low flow. So during the high flow period, this is when spills are occurring, and in blue there is this is the generation, And the capacity factor is much higher because it's a run-of-the-river reservoir. So we're talking about a capacity factor of 75%. Even if this is a high flow, there is a reserve that is not contributing to the capacity factor, and which is about 15%. And it is remained, and this is sustained throughout the hours of the day. And if you look at the maximum operational capacity and minimum generation, this is the flexibility that can be provided by the plant. There could be any flexibility, any change in operation within that range. We need to define for how long, however, but this is a flexibility that is available. Given the power system requirements in the market, it's being used here as something pretty constant throughout the day. During the lower flow period, that corresponds to our lower capacity factor here during the summer. Look at the generation, which is much lower. However, the reserve service is higher. We're talking about 25% of reserve. So put this in context with the capacity factor, which is here about 50%. For 50% capacity factor, you're using 25% of the installed capacity for reserve. And something to notice as well is that that flexible generation here between hours of 0 to 4, which is a 30% change in generation over a range of couple hours. So here again, it means that 25% of the reserve and 30% of installed capacity used for flexible generation, and that's the same order of magnitude as the generation itself. So this is the type of flexibility that we're talking about here and that hydropower is providing. I want to mention as well is that it's because it's a low flow condition that can be seen as a constraint that is also offering the flexibility in reserve and flexible generation. So here hydrology and the water management infrastructure is providing that service. So coming back here to our factor, I think that we're demonstrating that the high capacity factor in May, when the generation is the highest, the reason it's that high is also because power system requirements on the reserve are actually lower. So it's really increasing that capacity factor. However, when the flow is the lowest in September and October, it can be seen as a constraint because the water is not here, but actually it's a combination with power system operational requirements that require much more reserve at that time. So need to find the right measure to represent the actual flexibility of the system. And the capacity factor here is really showing the compounded events of water availability and power system requirements. Another metric that I'm showing here on the right is the CDF of absolute ramping as percent of the installed capacity. Each line is for a different month, and in gray that was for the high flow month, and in red that was for the low flow month. And what is the way to make it work? That's why I have those little arrows here. Those are deviation in installed capacity. So the amount, the frequency of operations that are within plus or minus 10% of the installed capacity represent 80% of the operations during the low flow conditions. It means that during low flow conditions, over that case study, 20% of the operations sustain variations in generation that are exceeding plus or minus percent in installed capacity, which is very large. And you can see during the gray, on the gray colors during the summer, how it's being used with less flexibility. So that's a measure on how it's presently being used. So with this, I would like to have two slides, one on conclusions and two on the next step. So I'd like to conclude first that, yes, variations in fuel availability impact the hydropower capacity factor and provide flexibility to the power system. we've also seen that non-fuel specific requirement constraints, such as power system and facility, are affecting that capacity factor tremendously. On our case study in particular, we show that reserve services are being maintained to meet power system requirements, and they also provide very flexible operations. And in our case study, we show that those flexible operations were affecting the capacity factor. Well, they were of the same range as the capacity factors. Like, we had a variation in installed capacity that was the same range as the capacity factor. So coming back here on the right side with that diagram, 30% contribute the capacity factor for generation, 50% is provided by hydropower for sustained reserve, and then everything that is in between is coming from the fuel availability, but the power system requirements are requiring the same flexibility that fuel variability is providing. This is a case study specific because those are run of the river. So in terms of next step, we'd like to have we are working on other case studies, and this webinar might be actually the right opportunity to ask if other utilities might be interested in sharing their data so that we can look at hydropower operations the way that we've been presenting here. There are other services, such as inertia, that are affected by hydropower availability because they're functions of how many units are being online. So this is not what we presented here today, but that we are considering for our analysis. What we want to understand is how river operations support other technology and markets. Here we really just isolated how much hydropower is affecting the capacity factors, but they are interdependency. If you look here at this pie, it's not just fuel-specific. Power system requirements are not the same for all fuels. They actually differ. And so if we want to value hydropower, we need to understand what are those dependencies. In particular, river operations are going to support electrothermal technology with stream temperature, which is affecting the capacity factor. Same thing to support the integration of renewables. And we are looking at the energy imbalance market, which tends to decouple from the water management. So here again, it may affect our measures, and we would like to have feedback on the measures that we are using. And finally, where it's going, it leads to the representation of hydropower in power system model and rescheduling. As we've seen here with the metrics, if we want to measure and communicate the flexibility of hydropower and how it can be harnessed by the power systems, we need to make sure that this is well represented. So a risk-based availability of a range of service in particular, and also the optimization of service. Really, presently the allocation between generation, reserve, flexible generation, and coordination might come from exogenous profile. It needs to be more dynamic and under a range of water and power system conditions. So with this, I'd like to thank you and provide you with the contact information so that you can reach out with questions and if you have any feedback.
Okay, thank you, Nathalie. So we've got time for a few questions. I'll remind you that the Q&A box is down in the lower right-hand corner. And we've had one question that has come in, and it's really a good question about the future growth of the industry, making note that hydro capacity has been fairly flat for the last 10 years or perhaps more. And what do you see as far as the growth of the industry is concerned? What's the opportunity for increased installation of this very flexible capacity? And what are the main challenges to expanding the hydro capacity? Patrick, Nathalie, you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I can take a crack at it. So we looked at this in some detail in a 2016 study called the Hydropower Vision. It's a long-term planning type exercise. I think what you're going to see steadily through time is that the vast majority of our large existing hydro is here to stay. and it's getting optimized and refined and upgraded through time. So you'll see incremental capacity additions there. You'll see incremental improvements in water optimization and water management technology that free up a little bit of that flexibility. Sort of running against that, though, is that often when entering a relicense, a lot of these projects, who are licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for somewhere between 30 to 50 years, it depends. When they come back up, the rules, governing their operations are revisited, and a lot of the projects are having flexibility restricted in terms of how fast they can ramp, and what minimum levels of water they have to keep in the river system are for environmental purposes. So you'll see these two conflicting trends running up against each other. In terms of large-scale new development, there are opportunity non-power dams and canals and conduits. Those projects are less flexible, but there's opportunity. And DOE's also looking at can you reinvent hydropower to build in sites where there's multi-use advantages. But to get to the point of the question, I think if you're going to see large-scale new flexible hydropower development, that's going to be in the context of pump storage, if the economics can sort out, or in some cases you'll see new large-scale water resource development for irrigation as water availability changes in the future.
And what about the siting challenges, Patrick? Just my own personal observations over the last years is that there tends to be a lot of intervention whenever you try to site a hydro project. Is that still a broad concern?
It is. I think it's unlikely that you'd see new big dams built specifically for hydropower. Pump storage as a concept is pretty flexible, so there are concepts such as closed loop where you basically build it off of any regular connection to a main river system, which reduces some of the impacts. We actually have multiple pump storage projects licensed for operation, new pump storage licensed for operation and construction in the U.S. I think right now it's just an economic challenge. So while you won't see big hydro for hydro's sake, you might see storage, whether it's pump storage for power or water storage that has some flexibility attached to it.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here about the metrics that are used to calculate the flexibility available from hydro. It seemed like the flexibility definition was fairly general here. Are you using any more detailed metrics on ramping or other flexibility measures, or is it more a sort of generic concept of how much the plant can change its output over a given period of time?
Maybe I can have a crack at this one. Well, so there is, in terms of flexibility, we are using different measures depending at the scale we are looking at it. So when we are going down at the case study, we've been looking at flexibility on switching from one service to another. So we've been really drilling down for ancillary services, what's the flexibility. We are still looking into a range of metrics. Capacity factor and installed capacity was one, but really looking at risk-based probability. And because it's related to water management, we need to understand what can be communicated to power system models as well as for scheduling. So we are trying to develop metrics that can have both value for supporting decision making.
Yeah, this is a good area to watch what's going on in the rest of the industry too, because flexibility is a very hot topic nowadays, and how to measure flexibility and how to extract flexibility from the system and how to get those flexibility measures into the unit commitment and economic dispatch programs, I think will be an ongoing topic of interest. So there's probably some good power systems developments in that field that you could carry over into the hydropower database. Third question here on conflicting reports about the O&M impacts of increased cycling or mileage on the hydro plants. I think that you brought that up in your presentation, Patrick, the increased O&M. And any real data on what the impact of cycling is, or how the changes in cycling the plants has affected the O&M, or is it mostly anecdotal?
It's still anecdotal. There have been efforts in industry to effectively quantify what, for example, a start costs. Going at component by component. Looking at stresses on stator windings and that type of thing. I think we know it costs something. It's just hard to say because hydropower equipment's generally pretty reliable. It's sort of a silly little anecdote, but I've heard consistent things about when you have more starts and stops, the one thing that you end up with are breaker problems. But that's an easy maintenance fix. I think the broader equipment concerns are one where we don't have great insight at this point.
Yeah, I think it's an area where there's a general lack of data across the industry, so a good place to focus some attention. All right, so we're about at the top of the hour. We're going to need to wrap it up. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which is going to be on Tuesday, December 18th at 2 p.m. And that webinar will feature Bob Zavadil from Internex and Ryan Quint from NERC. They'll share some of the latest updates and perspectives related to power plant model development and verification for inverter-based resources connected to the bulk power system. It's another very timely topic on the national scene, given the growing interest in wind and solar, and I hope you'll be able to join us for that one as well. Further information on all the webinars and meetings can be found on the website at www.esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails. Patrick and Nathalie, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your participation today. We look forward to seeing you again next month, so thanks and take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.